The courtroom was alive with murmurs and the faint shuffle of papers. Sunlight streamed through tall, dusty windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. A few spectators sat scattered in the gallery, their eyes darting between the judge's bench and the defendant standing nervously in front of it. The air felt heavy, as if the room itself knew that something important, or perhaps something deeply unsettling, was about to unfold. Judge Harold Whitmore adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable but undeniably stern. He had a reputation around town for being tough, almost unyielding in his judgments. Some called him fair, others whispered behind closed doors that he was anything but impartial. Today, his sharp gaze fixed on the young woman standing before him. Her name was Maya Johnson, and she looked out of place in the cold, formal setting of the courtroom. Dressed simply in a plain blouse and skirt, her hands were clasped tightly together, betraying her nerves despite her calm exterior. Maya had been charged with trespassing after allegedly entering private property without permission. According to the property owner, she had ignored posted signs warning visitors to stay away. But Maya's story was different. She claimed she had taken a wrong turn while trying to find a nearby community center where she volunteered regularly. Lost and unsure of her surroundings, she had wandered onto the property by mistake. When confronted by security, she apologized immediately and left without argument. Yet here she was now, facing charges that seemed disproportionate to her actions. The prosecutor painted a damning picture, describing Maya as reckless and willful, someone who showed no respect for boundaries or authority. "Your Honor," he said, his voice rising slightly for emphasis, "this isn't just about one incident. It's about sending a message that such behavior won't be tolerated." His words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Throughout the proceedings, Judge Whitmore listened intently, or at least appeared to. In truth, his mind was already made up. To him, this case wasn't complicated. Trespassing was trespassing, regardless of intent. And so, when it came time for Maya to speak, her soft-spoken explanation barely registered with him. She described how she had been helping organize programs for underprivileged youth at the community center, how she had gotten lost because the GPS on her phone malfunctioned. She even offered to provide contact information for the people she worked with, hoping they could vouch for her character. But none of it mattered. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room grew palpable. Maya's heart pounded in her chest, though she tried hard not to show it. She glanced at the small group of supporters sitting in the back, a few friends and colleagues who had come to stand by her side, but found little comfort in their presence. All she could do was wait and hope that the judge would see reason, that he would recognize her sincerity and let her go with a warning. But Judge Whitmore wasn't known for second chances. As he leaned forward in his chair, preparing to deliver his verdict, there was an unmistakable hardness in his eyes. The courtroom fell silent, every breath held in anticipation. No one, not even Maya, could have guessed what was coming next, or how profoundly it would alter the course of everyone's lives. Judge Harold Whitmore's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Guilty," he declared, his tone cold and final. The word echoed in the courtroom, sending a ripple of shock through the small group of spectators. Maya's heart sank as she heard the verdict, her legs trembling beneath her. Without hesitation, Judge Whitmore sentenced her to 6 months in jail and imposed a hefty fine. It was a punishment that felt far too severe for the alleged crime, but no one dared to speak up. The bailiffs moved quickly, stepping forward to take Maya into custody. As they led her away, Maya's eyes locked onto Judge Whitmore's face for just a moment. There was no anger in her gaze, only a quiet sadness that seemed to pierce through the judge's usual stoic exterior. For a fleeting second, he hesitated, his gavel hovering midair before he brought it down with a sharp crack. The sound signaled the end of the trial, but something about the way Maya looked at him lingered in his mind. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was something different about her, something that didn't fit the image he had constructed in his head during the hearing. Moments later, as the courtroom began to empty, One of the court clerks approached Judge Whitmore with a folder. She had been instructed earlier to gather additional background information on the defendant, standard procedure in certain cases, and what she found had left her stunned. Handing the file to the judge, she cleared her throat nervously. "Your Honor," she said softly, "you might want to take a look at this." Judge Whitmore opened the folder, scanning the contents with growing disbelief. According to the documents, Maya Johnson wasn't just any ordinary woman who had wandered onto private property. She was an accomplished civil rights attorney who had spent years advocating for marginalized communities both domestically and abroad. Her work had taken her to conflict zones and underserved neighborhoods, where she fought tirelessly to protect the rights of those who had no voice. She had earned awards, delivered speeches at international forums, and inspired countless others with her dedication to justice. The revelation hit Judge Whitmore like a ton of bricks. His face flushed red, partly from embarrassment, and partly from the weight of what he had just done. How could he have missed this? How could he not have seen who she really was? His mind raced as he replayed the events of the trial in his head. Had he judged her too harshly because of her appearance? Because of the color of her skin? The questions gnawed at him, refusing to let go. For years, Judge Whitmore prided himself on being fair and impartial, but now he couldn't escape the nagging suspicion that his biases had clouded his judgment. He thought back to Maya's calm demeanor during the trial, her respectful responses, and the dignity she maintained even when faced with accusations that painted her as reckless and defiant. Everything about her had screamed integrity, yet he had dismissed it all without a second thought. As the reality of his mistake settled over him, Judge Whitmore felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He sat back in his chair, running a hand over his face, as if trying to wipe away the shame that threatened to consume him. What had he done? And more importantly, what could he possibly do to make it right? The courtroom was nearly empty now, save for a few lingering staff members tidying up after the day's proceedings. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the polished floors. But inside Judge Whitmore's mind, the storm was just beginning. He knew that this moment would haunt him unless he found a way to confront the truth, not just about Maya, but about himself. The weight of the revelation pressed down on Judge Whitmore like a leaden cloak. He sat alone in his chambers, the folder containing Maya's background information spread out before him. The room was eerily quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, a sound that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. His mind raced as he tried to reconcile the image of the woman he had sentenced with the person described in the documents. Civil rights attorney, advocate for marginalized communities, a voice for the voiceless. Every detail contradicted his assumptions about her, and it left him feeling exposed, vulnerable, and deeply unsettled. He picked up one of the papers and read it again, as if hoping the words might somehow change or offer an explanation for what had happened. They didn't. Instead, they painted a picture of someone who embodied everything he claimed to value: fairness, integrity, and justice. Yet here he was, having handed down a harsh sentence to someone who had spent her life fighting for those very principles. The irony wasn't lost on him. In fact, it stung like salt on an open wound. His thoughts drifted back to earlier cases where defendants had stood before him just as Maya had, their faces unfamiliar, their backgrounds unknown. How many times had he made snap judgments based on appearances? How often had his biases crept into his rulings without him even realizing it? The question swirled in his mind, relentless and unyielding. For years, he had prided himself on being a fair judge, but now he wondered if that pride had been misplaced all along. Unable to sit still any longer, Judge Whitmore rose from his chair and paced the length of the room. His polished leather shoes clicked against the hardwood floor, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent space. He felt trapped, not by the walls of his chambers, but by the enormity of his mistake. What could he possibly say to make things right? An apology would feel hollow, inadequate, and even if Maya accepted it, how could he undo the damage he had caused? As he paced, his eyes landed on a framed photograph sitting on the corner of his desk. It was a picture of his late father, a man who had instilled in him the importance of fairness and accountability. A judge isn't just a title, his father used to say. It's a responsibility, to see people for who they are, not who you assume them to be. The memory hit him like a punch to the gut. Had he failed his father's legacy? Worse yet, had he failed the very system he swore to uphold? Determined to confront the situation head-on, Judge Whitmore decided to request a private meeting with Maya. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He couldn't undo the sentence he had handed down, but perhaps he could begin to make amends. Summoning his assistant, he instructed her to arrange the meeting as soon as possible. She nodded hesitantly, clearly sensing the gravity of the moment, and hurried off to carry out his request. Left alone once again, Judge Whitmore sank back into his chair, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them together. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Apologies could only go so far, and trust, once broken, was difficult to rebuild. But for the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly reflect on his actions and the impact they had on others. The realization was painful, but it also carried a glimmer of hope. If he could acknowledge his mistakes, maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to move forward. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in hues of orange and purple. The world beyond the courthouse continued its rhythm, oblivious to the storm brewing within one man's conscience. For Judge Whitmore, however, nothing would ever be the same again. The meeting was scheduled for later that evening, after the courthouse had emptied and the hallways fell silent. Judge Whitmore waited anxiously in a small conference room, his hands clasped tightly on the table in front of him. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as he replayed what he planned to say over and over in his mind. He knew an apology wouldn't be enough. How could it be? But he also knew he couldn't avoid this conversation. It wasn't just about Maya anymore. It was about confronting the uncomfortable truths he had spent years ignoring. When Maya finally entered the room, escorted by a court officer, Judge Whitmore stood up instinctively. She looked composed, her posture straight, and her expression unreadable. There was no trace of anger or bitterness in her eyes, only a quiet strength that made him feel even smaller than he already did. As she took a seat across from him, the officer closed the door behind her, leaving them alone in the dimly lit space. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, wide and daunting. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat nervously, breaking the stillness. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice unsteady, I want to start by saying I'm sorry." The words came out haltingly, each one weighted with guilt. "What happened today? It shouldn't have. I didn't realize who you were, or rather, I didn't take the time to truly see you." Maya listened without interrupting, her gaze steady and piercing. When Judge Whitmore paused, searching for the right words to continue, she finally spoke. Her voice was calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Your Honor," she said, leaning forward slightly, "this isn't about me. Not really. Because if I weren't an attorney, if I didn't have credentials or titles, you'd still be sitting here thinking you made the right call. That's the problem." Her words hit him like a punch to the chest, stealing the breath from his lungs. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. She was right, and they both knew it. His apology, however sincere, didn't change the fact that his judgment had been clouded by prejudice. If anything, it highlighted the deeper issue at play, not just within himself, but within the justice system as a whole. Maya continued, her tone softening slightly but still unwavering. "You sentenced me because of how I look, not because of what I've done. And while I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge that, it doesn't undo the harm caused, not just to me, but to countless others who don't get a second chance. People who don't have degrees or awards to prove their worth. People who are judged before they even step into a courtroom." Judge Whitmore felt the weight of her words settle over him, heavier than any gavel he had ever wielded. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't meant to act out of bias. But deep down, he knew there was no excuse. Instead, he nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping under the burden of accountability. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I failed you, and I've failed others too. I can't undo what's been done, but I need to do better, for everyone." Maya studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling softly. "Then show me," she said simply. "Show me you mean it. Words are important, but actions matter more. Use your position to make real change, not just for people like me, but for those who don't have a voice." The challenge in her statement hung in the air, undeniable and unyielding. Judge Whitmore felt a flicker of resolve ignite within him. This wasn't just about redemption, it was about responsibility. For the first time in years, he realized that being the judge wasn't just about handing down sentences. It was about ensuring fairness, even when it was hard, even when it forced him to confront his own flaws. As the meeting drew to a close, Judge Whitmore extended his hand hesitantly. Maya regarded it for a moment before shaking it firmly, her grip strong and deliberate. It was a small gesture, but it carried the promise of something greater. A chance to rebuild trust, to learn, and to grow. That night, Judge Harold Whitmore lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as thoughts swirled endlessly in his mind. Sleep eluded him, just as it had on nights when he wrestled with difficult cases or tough decisions. But this time, it wasn't a legal dilemma keeping him up, it was shame. He replayed Maya's words over and over again, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. People who are judged before they even step into a courtroom. Her voice echoed in his head, refusing to let him escape the reality of his own biases. The next morning, Judge Whitmore arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. For once, he didn't dive straight into paperwork or prepare for hearings. Instead, he pulled out his laptop and began researching systemic racism within the justice system. At first, he skimmed articles hesitantly, unsure of what he might find. But soon, the information overwhelmed him. Statistics showing disproportionate sentencing for black defendants, studies highlighting implicit bias among judges and law enforcement, personal stories of lives derailed by unfair treatment. It was like peeling back layers of an onion, revealing truths he had ignored for far too long. Determined to confront these issues head-on, Judge Whitmore enrolled in a series of seminars on racial equity and implicit bias. These weren't mandatory sessions, they were voluntary steps toward understanding the scope of the problem and his role in it. Sitting alongside social workers, activists, and other legal professionals, he listened intently as speakers shared their experiences and insights. Some presentations hit close to home, forcing him to reflect on his own behavior. Others opened his eyes to systemic flaws he hadn't fully grasped before. Each session left him humbled, yet more resolved to change. But education alone wasn't enough. Judge Whitmore also sought counseling to explore the roots of his biases. During one particularly raw session, he admitted to the therapist that he often associated certain behaviors with guilt, even when there was no evidence to support such assumptions. "It's like my brain has been wired to see patterns that aren't really there," he confessed, frustration creeping into his voice. The therapist nodded sympathetically, explaining that implicit bias was universal but could be unlearned with effort and self-awareness. This revelation gave Judge Whitmore hope, though he knew the journey wouldn't be easy. Back at work, subtle changes began to take shape in Judge Whitmore's courtroom. He started paying closer attention to the language used during trials, ensuring that prosecutors and defense attorneys presented balanced arguments. When defendants stood before him, he made a conscious effort to listen, not just to their words, but to their tone, their body language, and the context behind their actions. He implemented new practices, such as asking bailiffs to remove handcuffs from nonviolent offenders during hearings, recognizing how dehumanizing restraints could skew perceptions of guilt. Word of his efforts began to spread, though reactions were mixed. Some colleagues praised him for taking accountability, while others dismissed his actions as performative or unnecessary. A few even accused him of being too soft on crime. Despite the criticism, Judge Whitmore pressed on, driven by a growing sense of purpose. Every small step felt like progress, even if the larger fight against systemic injustice seemed insurmountable. One evening, as he packed up his briefcase to leave the courthouse, Judge Whitmore paused to look around the empty courtroom. Shadows stretched across the benches, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence. He thought about all the people who had passed through those doors, some guilty, some innocent, all deserving of fairness. For years, he had viewed himself as a neutral arbiter of justice. Now, he understood that neutrality wasn't enough. True justice required action, empathy, and constant vigilance. As he turned off the lights and locked the door behind him, Judge Whitmore felt a flicker of determination ignite within him. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was ready to walk it, not because he had to, but because it was the right thing to do. Judge Whitmore's transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was undeniable. Slowly, his courtroom began to feel different, not just to him, but to everyone who stepped inside. Defendants noticed the subtle shifts first. Handcuffs were removed for nonviolent cases, creating a less intimidating atmosphere. Attorneys appreciated how Judge Whitmore encouraged thorough explanations of circumstances rather than rushing through proceedings. Even the bailiffs and court clerks remarked on the change in his demeanor, calmer, more patient, and genuinely engaged. Word of these changes spread beyond the courthouse walls. Local news outlets picked up on the story after a reporter observed one of Judge Whitmore's hearings and wrote about the kinder, fairer bench. The article sparked debate across the community. Some praised him for taking accountability and making meaningful reforms, while skeptics questioned whether his actions were sincere or merely an attempt to salvage his reputation. Letters poured into the courthouse, some supportive, others scathing, but Judge Whitmore read them all, using both praise and criticism as fuel to keep improving. Inspired by Maya's challenge during their private meeting, Judge Whitmore decided to take his efforts further. He introduced mandatory implicit bias training for himself, his staff, and even local law enforcement officers who frequently appeared in his courtroom. At first, there was resistance. Officers grumbled about wasting time, and some court employees dismissed the sessions as unnecessary. But Judge Whitmore stood firm, emphasizing that fairness wasn't optional, it was essential. Over time, attitudes began to shift. Participants started sharing stories of how the training helped them recognize their own biases, leading to more thoughtful interactions with the public. But perhaps the most impactful step Judge Whitmore took was revising sentencing guidelines. He collaborated with legal experts, social workers, and community leaders to create policies that prioritize rehabilitation over punishment, especially for minor offenses. For example, instead of jail time, individuals convicted of trespassing or similar charges could opt for community service or counseling programs. These initiatives not only reduced overcrowding in jails, but also gave people a real chance to turn their lives around. The ripple effects of Judge Whitmore's reforms reached far beyond his courtroom. Inspired by his work, other judges in the district began implementing similar changes. A task force was formed to address racial disparities in sentencing, and Judge Whitmore played a key role in its creation. His once skeptical colleagues now looked to him as a leader, someone willing to face uncomfortable truths and act on them. Despite the progress, Judge Whitmore knew he couldn't rest on his laurels. One day, while reviewing case files, he came across a letter from a former defendant who had benefited from the new sentencing guidelines. The man described how completing a job training program had allowed him to secure stable employment and reconnect with his family. Reading those words filled Judge Whitmore with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. It reminded him why he had chosen this career in the first place, to make a difference. Still, not everyone was convinced of his sincerity. During a town hall meeting, a young woman stood up and confronted him directly. "How do we know you're not just doing this for show?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Judge Whitmore paused, letting her question hang in the air. Then he responded honestly. "You don't," he said. "All I can do is prove myself through my actions moving forward. If I fail, hold me accountable." His transparency won over many doubters, including the young woman, who nodded thoughtfully before sitting back down. That moment solidified Judge Whitmore's commitment to transparency and collaboration. He realized that true justice wasn't something he could achieve alone. It required partnership, trust, and continuous effort. As months turned into years, Judge Whitmore's courtroom became a model for reform. People no longer dreaded appearing before him. Instead, they saw an opportunity for fairness and understanding. And though he still faced challenges, he welcomed them, knowing that every obstacle was another chance to grow and improve. Months had passed since that fateful meeting between Judge Whitmore and Maya, and though their interaction had been brief, its impact lingered. One afternoon, as Judge Whitmore sat in his chambers reviewing case files, he found himself thinking about Maya again. Her words during their private conversation, sharp yet compassionate, had stayed with him, challenging him to dig deeper into the roots of injustice. He realized that while his reforms were making a difference, they were only part of the solution. Real change required collaboration, especially with those who had dedicated their lives to fighting for equality. Summoning the courage to reach out, Judge Whitmore sent a letter to Maya. In it, he apologized once more for his actions, but also expressed his desire to work together on a larger initiative. "You inspired me to confront my biases," he wrote, "but I know I can't do this alone. Your expertise and passion could help create something transformative, not just for our community, but for the justice system as a whole." He ended the letter by asking if she'd be willing to meet again to discuss a potential partnership. To his surprise and relief, Maya agreed. When they met at a quiet cafe near the courthouse, the atmosphere was less tense than their previous encounter. Over coffee, Judge Whitmore laid out his vision, a landmark program aimed at reducing racial disparities in sentencing. He proposed hosting town halls, drafting policy recommendations, and educating the public about systemic racism in the legal system. But instead of presenting it as his project, he emphasized that it needed to be a joint effort, one where Maya's voice would lead the way. Maya listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. She didn't immediately agree, knowing that partnering with someone like Judge Whitmore, a figure of authority she had once mistrusted, would raise eyebrows. Yet she also recognized the opportunity before her. If they worked together, they could amplify each other's efforts and bring attention to issues that often went unnoticed. After a long pause, she nodded. "I'll do it," she said firmly, "but only if we're equals in this. No tokenism, no lip service." Judge Whitmore readily agreed, and thus began an unlikely but powerful partnership. Together, they drafted policies designed to address inequities in bail amounts, plea deals, and probation requirements. They organized town halls where community members could share their experiences with the justice system, ensuring that real voices shaped the reforms. At these events, Maya spoke passionately about the need for systemic change, while Judge Whitmore listened intently, using his position to validate and support her message. Their collaboration wasn't without challenges. Critics accused Maya of selling out by working with a judge many still viewed with suspicion. Others dismissed Judge Whitmore's involvement as a publicity stunt, but both remained steadfast, leaning on each other during moments of doubt. When backlash grew intense, Maya reminded Judge Whitmore why they were doing this. "It's not about us. It's about leaving something better behind." As months turned into years, their efforts bore fruit. The policies they championed were adopted by courts across the district, leading to measurable reductions in racial disparities in sentencing. Their town halls sparked conversations that rippled through schools, churches, and community centers, fostering greater awareness of systemic racism. Even skeptics began to acknowledge the sincerity of their mission, inspired by the tangible results they achieved. Through it all, Judge Whitmore and Maya developed a mutual respect that transcended their initial conflict. Where there had once been tension, there was now trust. Where there had been judgment, there was understanding. They proved that even the most unlikely alliances could spark meaningful change, if both parties were willing to listen, learn, and grow. By the time they unveiled their final report, a comprehensive guide to equitable justice practices, they stood side by side, two very different individuals united by a shared purpose. As applause filled the room during the launch event, Judge Whitmore turned to Maya and whispered, "Thank you for believing in me." Her response was simple but profound. "Belief is earned. You've earned mine." Years passed, and the legacy of Judge Whitmore and Maya's partnership continued to resonate far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Though Judge Whitmore eventually retired from the bench, his reforms left an indelible mark on the justice system. The policies they had championed became a blueprint for other districts, spreading like wildfire as communities demanded fairer treatment for all. Judges, lawyers, and law enforcement officers began to see accountability not as a burden, but as a responsibility, one that could restore trust between the people and the institutions meant to serve them. Maya, too, carried their work forward with unwavering determination. She became a national figure in the fight for racial justice, traveling across the country to speak at conferences, lead workshops, and advocate for systemic change. Her story, the tale of how she stood firm against prejudice and inspired even those who doubted her, became a beacon of hope for countless others. People saw in her resilience a reminder that progress was possible, even when faced with seemingly insurmountable odds. But what truly set their partnership apart was its ripple effect. Young attorneys and activists drew inspiration from their unlikely alliance, proving that collaboration across divides could yield extraordinary results. A new generation of leaders emerged, determined to tackle inequality head-on. They organized grassroots campaigns, pushed for legislative changes, and held institutions accountable in ways that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier. And every time someone stood up to challenge injustice, they carried a piece of Maya and Judge Whitmore's story with them. For Judge Whitmore, retirement didn't mean stepping away from the cause. He spent his days mentoring young judges and speaking candidly about his journey, from the biases he once ignored to the lessons he learned through humility and self-reflection. His talks were raw and honest, often leaving audiences moved to tears. "I wasn't always right," he'd say, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But I chose to listen." That choice made all the difference. As for Maya, she remained steadfast in her mission, though she never forgot where it had begun. On the anniversary of their first meeting, she visited the courthouse where it all started. Standing outside, she marveled at how much had changed, not just within those walls but within herself. It was here that she had confronted a man whose actions had hurt her deeply, yet also here that she had chosen to extend grace and understanding. That decision, to believe in redemption, had sparked a chain reaction neither of them could have predicted. One evening, years later, Maya received a letter from a former defendant whose life had been transformed by the reforms she and Judge Whitmore had implemented. The man described how a second chance had allowed him to rebuild his relationships, pursue education, and contribute positively to society. Reading his words brought tears to Maya's eyes. This, she realized, was why they had fought so hard, not for accolades or recognition, but for moments like this, where lives were forever changed for the better. In the end, their story served as a powerful reminder of two truths: that no one is beyond redemption, and that true justice requires courage, empathy, and relentless effort. Judge Whitmore and Maya may have come from different worlds, but together, they proved that even the deepest divides could be bridged when people committed themselves to doing what was right. Their partnership became more than a chapter in history. It became a call to action, urging everyone to look inward, confront their biases, and strive for a world where fairness wasn't the exception, but the rule.